Welcome to the Truth Over Comfort show. Today's guest is Ryan Christian of the Last American Vagabond, here to talk about the World Economic Forum. I'm very pleased to have him here. How are you doing today, Ryan?
I'm good. I'm good. You're actually one of the very few people that did get my name correct, the way it's pronounced. Anyway,
Well,
Christian. It's Puerto Rican, so people tend to just say Christian, which I am okay with. But you actually said it correctly. Good for you.
I think I just said Christian and got lucky, to be honest.
Yeah. I'm doing
Anyway,
good. Thanks for having me on, man.
do you want to tell? Go on, sir.
I was gonna say I'm glad we finally connected. I thank you for your patience. I had all life happening around the side, so I'm glad we got together. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it too. So, do you want to tell people a little bit about yourself and the Last American Vagabond and how you sort of got into this subject area?
Yes, absolutely. Excuse me. For me, it started traveling. Like it was kind of in between things in my life in general. I'm a classically trained chef. That's what I grew up. I went to culinary school. That's what I did my whole life, and very passionate when it comes to food and all of that. And so I never really saw this being kind of the direction that my life was going to go. And who knows where it's going to go in the future. But ultimately, I mean, I shouldn't say that I'm so ridiculously dedicated to this. I doubt I'm ever going to change. But I kind of was on in between things at the time with my friend of mine. We were traveling in the RV just around the United States. At the time, I was focused on cooking still. I mean, I was looking for trying to find. I just wanted something different, and I was trying to find like another chef position. Actually ended up getting a GM position in Texas for a while, like on this path. Wasn't happy with that. We left somewhere else, and he started this blog about sports just randomly, and I just was like, wasn't really even interested in it, but just wanted something to do. And I was like, I'm going to start my own kind of just random little blog, and started off on like I think it was blog.com, one of these little random blog sites. And I didn't even know what I was doing, what I was expecting to make. And it kind of developed into sort of like this cannabis law reform discussion. Like it was all about, because that for me was the biggest thing I really first kind of picked up on was how wildly dishonest that conversation is. Looking at the Reefer Madness movie that was put out as a documentary, but now it's in the comedy section, we can really see the arc of how ridiculous they can be. And so it just kind of broadened out from there into, over the years into, what it's become today with, great honor to work with excellent writers out there in the world and interviewers. And it just kind of built into something I never expected. And it's now just about, what you're being lied to about government, anything, I mean, I don't shy away from any topics to be quite honest, but it's a long journey and still long ways to go.
Just out of interest, where did the name The Last American Vagabond come from? I always sort of wondered about it. I wasn't really sure what it meant. I think I looked it up once, but I'm not entirely sure what it actually is or means. Could you just explain that?
Yeah. What's funny is, and the way my mind works, I guess, and the way I've grown up is, I kind of go by my instincts and my gut in a lot of ways, and this was something. We were traveling, and I've always been a big traveler. Immediately I was 18, I went out and traveled Europe, and I did that multiple times. I've traveled to many different countries over the years, and it's really a big passion of mine to see the world and understand different perspectives, even as a young kid. And so traveling was what we were already doing, and I forget where I think the word vagabond had come up in previous. Oh, that's actually where that word came from. It's funny. I don't think I've ever even connected this on a show before. There's a great book called Vagabonding, just like the word vagabond, but ing after vagabonding. And it's just, and I mean, I recommend it to anybody. It's an outstanding book that basically, it's basically a guide on how to live a life of live on the cheap, travel, a sustainable life. In fact, if you really want to just do it forever, which a lot of people out there really enjoy. And so that was kind of my mindset. I love that concept of being, and a lot of people think vagabond, there's different definitions to it. Obviously there's terms that make it like a dirty vagabond traveler kind of thing. But in most cases, it just means sort of a traveler, right? It's somebody that is not traveling with a destination in mind. You're like an aimless traveler, right? And I like that concept. And so my mindset when I wrote this down was like, well, I'm the last American vagabond in that sense, where like my mindset was very US centric, and I still am for the most part, but I've gotten world politics for the most part. But at that time, I was really focused on how it pertained to the United States. And I thought that the US, and I think we all see now, is it was in a very bad way, even back then. And I'm thinking like, we're losing ourselves. We're losing that kind of mindset, the spirit of what we believe we were at the very least. And so that's what that really came from. And it's developed. The reason I said what I said in the beginning is I feel like I've developed into it and I've defined it more as I've grown into this. And for me, it really now has become like, it's about the One, it's about the journey. That's always something I think I point out. It's not just the destination, but the journey. But it's really about never being just, it's like, the science is settled. That's the opposite of what we're talking about, right? It's about making sure you're always questioning things. You're always on the path, right? You're always continuing to travel down the path of truth. And it doesn't matter. Things come up, you get information you think you're solid with, but then you question. New things come up, new people say different things, and you go, okay, well, stand back and evaluate. And I think that's what it's really about. It's that the vagabond, the endless pursuit of truth.
Yeah, does the word vagabond come from the word vagrant, which I remember from my doing history at school is like a vagrant, someone who sort of, yeah, as you said, like traveled with sort of no purpose, but it was more of a, a term to insult them, really, wasn't it?
Yeah, well, vagrant is more specific, and that's the sense that's used more like somebody who's just like lingering outside of a building. Whereas vagabond, there's many different definitions, but the most common is just a traveler. There's no real negative connotation to it. It's somebody that's just passing through. And that's kind of the idea. Is it's always on that path. But everyone's gonna make it derogatory if they want to, or so on. But I really love it. Like I've never regretted it, and I've always looked at it as something I'm very proud of because I think it's we always need to continue on this path of understanding not just truth, even just diving into deeper questions about things that we may never answer, like the fundamental truth of where we come from and religion and everything else. That's what we are here for, in my opinion, as a species, to continue to figure things out personally and as a species, as a community, I guess.
Well, I'm glad that I actually finally know what the terminology of vagabond was and why you chose that. It's quite an interesting concept. Anyway, we're here obviously to talk about the World Economic Forum. So can you tell people who they are? When was they founded? How old is it? And, who founded it?
Oh, well, if we're going to get in like when it comes to like specifics like that, I'm not exactly the person to go down these deep rabbit holes of all, but I'll happily give you my thoughts on this stuff, though. In regard to the World Economic Forum, I could look up and tell you when they were founded and so on. I'll recommend Whitney Webb's research to get into the deep, dive on this stuff. But World Economic Forum is a really problematic, they see themselves as like the public-private partnership, or the overlap, really, which is where the whole fascist concept comes in. There's like this worldwide kind of blending of corporate and government mindsets, and that's what they're kind of framing themselves as this worldwide model of where we should be going. And what's really interesting for me is that the World Economic Forum itself is, as if we understand the way that history has worked and these groups that have been there behind the scenes this whole time, there's an argument to be made that these people, this kind of unelected power structure, elitists, technocrats, have always really been there in the wings, lobbying, influencing, and so on. But now we're at a point where they want to resurface, essentially. They want to put their head back out and be like, we are the face of who's in charge of what's happening. Whereas people might argue that's new, but really it's just, we might argue that that's them exposing what's always been happening, right? And so where this is going is that this is now this kind of partnership amongst behind the scene entities, whether they're politicians, media, and we've talked about the young global leaders a lot on the platform and what that means and the background there. And it's like a cultivation of different powerful entities in this one like lockstep agenda for where they want to, where they frame it as it's like save the world, right? Of course, it's all for your benefit. Everything's for you. But when you really just, barely scratch past the surface on pretty much everything they're putting forward, not only is it rife with possibility for corruption, that's just the first obvious thing that's always there. You're putting more power in concentrated few. It's ridiculous. But right beneath that, it's very clear that this is more about benefiting them so then they can benefit us, which is really kind of it's not even secret, right? It's like, well, we're good people, so give us all the power and you don't have to worry about anything. I just don't even know why anybody thinks that makes sense, from like just a logical standpoint. But yeah, wherever you want to go with that. But sorry, I didn't know we were going to get into like the deep, background of it, all that. But
yeah, I did think of that before the interview. I thought because you could just do like the brief overview. It's founded by Klaus Schwab in 1971 or the 90s. I can't remember the exact date. Or you could go down the Johnny Verdmore, the Kissinger, CIA. I wasn't really intending to go into that because it's kind of an episode in itself. And again, I wasn't really sure where you sat with that. Just a general overview. Mm-hmm. If you could just continue sort of on that line of, so what are their agendas? Who do they partner with? Or, again, this is obviously on their website. I try to put as much as in the show notes, but what sort of are their stated agendas? Obviously, the Great Reset
Right.
the sort of the newer sort of name to it. We can get into some other stuff later, like the Fourth Industrial Revolution. But just for now, who are their partners, their main partners, and what are their stated agendas?
Right. And just for people out there that are not familiar with my work, for those that may be new to Last American Vagabond in general, generally what I do on a day-to-day basis is kind of aggregate what's going on in the news and what's being reported, both independent and corporate, and try to like aggregate it down into something that is understandable and something that can be like repeated, where people can look at the source material, come to their own conclusions about it, and so on. So the reason I'm saying that is because these are things that, like I could have easily spent 2 hours researching all this beforehand. I just didn't really know we were going to get into the individual parts like this. But my point being is that this stuff is actually very important. And I would argue this is where people like Whitney Webb step in for the Last American Vagabond part of this, where they're just, as you know, right? Actually, funny enough, here is one of her cups, the Great Reset cups, which is funny, but she had great work on that. But anyway, to the point now, in regard to what their the World Economic Forum, as far as I can see, is partnering with pretty much every. There's some governments that seem to be resistant to it, but even then still have kind of like overlaps with it. But as far as I can tell, pretty much every major government in the planet is in line with what they're trying to accomplish, at least on the surface. This is where you can get into like Russia, for example. I've made this argument a lot, where I think it's very clear that all of these governments would love to have more control over your life, very obviously. And that's why we need to understand that there's no good guy, bad guy concept when it comes to these power structures. But Russia seems to be, in my opinion, going along with this because they can clearly use the Great Reset direction to take more power over their population. But at the same time, I would argue they don't like the loss of sovereignty to the larger World Economic Forum, WHO kind of partnership structure, And so that's what's interesting there. But then when you get into the deeper parts of this, you can see the real problem, in my opinion, like the corporate overlap, where you get, like, for instance, taking like a Pfizer discussion, right? Where you can see that you have companies that are doing, even specifically doing things that are being funded by the taxpayer. But then when it comes to something where we go, hey, wait a minute, I want to understand everything that's happening, I'm paying for it. They go, whoa, that's a private deal with this company. And that's how Whitney and I've talked about this in the past. I think I termed it the something shell game. I forget the term I used, but they're essentially playing this game where it's an easy way to hide everything they don't want you to be able to see behind the idea that it's not the government, even though they're doing it with them, right? And so that's the biggest concerning part for me. And those kind of relationships are everywhere you look right now, every major company, and they're all being lined up with this ESG kind of, better for the world mindset, even though that's not really what that is. So I don't know if we'll get into that or not, but wherever you want to go with that.
Yeah, if you could just maybe explain more about the Great Reset, because even myself, my own understanding, like the term sort of gets thrown around, but what does it actually exactly mean? Obviously, people aren't familiar. During COVID, Klaus Schwab, the founder of the World Economic Forum, wrote the book, The Great Reset, and and COVID-19, and he says, it's provided a window of opportunity to reset basically every different aspect of society, going forward, basically.
Yeah, well, the premise is the Fourth Industrial Revolution. That's he's written books on that specifically. He's written books about the Great Reset specifically, and the whole point. These are things that Klaus Schwab has basically, if not specifically, coined himself. Like, these are his concepts, and it's really about, like, so we understand the one, first, second, third industrial revolutions throughout history, and his argument is this is what we're. Actually, what's interesting to me is pre-COVID, up until his argument was like, this is coming, right? The fourth industrial revolution is coming, but it wasn't, as far as I can tell, unless you read the books and get into like the think tanks, on the surface defined as like a month from now, right? It was like this, way in the future, down the line, like that's how they want you to hear it as an individual. And then COVID-19 began, and that's when we saw all of those conversations about, oh, well, this is a perfect opportunity to initiate X, Y, and Z. And our point was immediately like, well, wait a minute here. All these things that are being dismissed as conspiracy theory, the implantables and all this stuff is what he tells you is part of the fourth industrial revolution. So therefore, he's telling you we're in that right now. So essentially, COVID-19 executed the beginning of the fourth industrial, but that doesn't make any sense. It ultimately boils down to either this was executed to do that, or it was just a never let a good crisis go to waste, kind of like, we'll grab onto that. But either way, it's inherently manipulative, because what in the world does this virus or not have to do with the fourth industrial revolution, right? It's a choice to use that to expedite the path. But it all comes down to what on the surface they argue is what's better for humanity, right? We need to reimagine everything. We need to redesign things. That's right. The Great Reset. What really inherently in that sentiment is that we need to destroy it first before we can redesign it and rebuild it. And that's a classic concept in these kind of elitist structures as far back as you want to look. What is it? I'm blanking on the term. The something from chaos. Is the term
Order out of chaos.
Thank you. Order out of chaos. It's classic, right? I mean, this is on everywhere you look. But so the fourth industrial revolution is the discussion about how they're going to, the next change of implantables, the bioeconomy, the technocratic future they're building. And we're talking about artificial intelligence, smart cities, 5G. That's what all this is about. The interesting part about that is that almost every single part of these things, including like the mRNA platform direction, it's all the same kind of thing, are not only being shown to be dangerous and not even in line with what they say they're supposed to do, but now it's beginning to appear that a lot of these things are intentionally done this way, right? And the question becomes why? Like, why would these things be put out that were hurting people or knowingly, if the point was to get people to go in that direction? So I don't really know the answer to that. But at the end of the day, we're seeing the push of implantables and all the rest of it on the tail of that it's better for your health and so on. But then we get the overlap with climate change, and all of this different stuff and the geoengineering aspect, and so the Great Reset part of it is about kind of arguing that the fourth industrial revolution was always going to come, but here is an opportunity for us to execute this massive reset. And the question is for average people listening, is that something you voted for? Is that what you want? Do you want to no longer have the things they tell you we don't need anymore? And we get into the minutia of it, the bugs and all these different things, and those are valid points to be discussed. But it shows you we have a group of elitist technocrats that aren't elected, who are essentially deciding whether by force or by committee, however you want to look at it, that we are going to change our entire lives from top to bottom. And then you can overlap that with like the foreign policy conversation if we want to get into that with Putin and Ukraine, and it just gets ridiculous how they try to couch like their entire agenda on like Putin did something bad and that's why it's all happening. It's out of control.
Yeah, just to sort of back you up there, if you go on the World Economic Forum's website, they have their partners, and it's basically every Fortune 500, 100 company in the world. And like you said, it's all about helping us and saving us and making the planet better. But then they partner with all the big arms corporations in the world. Who can anyone say they do anything good for anyone other than, the few people who obviously they employ in the towns around the country, if you want to go down that line. But for the rest of the world,
dispute, to be quite honest.
exactly. And then they're partnered with all the big oil companies who, they're obviously going to talk about climate change and everything, but then they're still partnered with the people they say obviously, destroyed the planet. So, it's very hard to take seriously when you look at, their partners. It's the same with any line of thinking, like if the US or the UK government say they're doing something for good reasons, but then they're also, the biggest sellers of arms around the world, they invade countries. How can you really obviously take them serious? So I just wondered what
I have one point actually, right, on what you're exactly saying. That's an excellent point. Is the ESG overlap we just talked about, right? Environmental, social, and governance is the kind of the point. And it's basically, as we've talked about, the social credit initiation, where they're basically, these corporate tenants about the point is that exactly what you just said, it's all hypocritical. We've already seen the UK and the United States literally argue that gas, oil, nuclear weapons are considered green, well, because they use them for freedom. They fight for freedom, which then creates more green. I mean, it's ridiculous, right? And so the core value, it's basically saying you can't drive your car, but we're going to continue to be the biggest polluters on the planet because we claim we're fighting for freedom, and we can all prove that's not even true. So it's inherently, like, on the surface, not even about the things they stress. Sustainability, equity, these are just buzzwords. They're not even trying to achieve those things. But the interesting part about it is it creates a secondary problem where people then actually start to fight against sustainability because they think that's the bad thing. No, they're not even trying for sustainability. They want you to think they're fighting for sustainability, right? It's all these different levels of it. But go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to ask so at least you could argue, maybe one might argue with the World Economic Forum, at least it's a bit more public. They put out clips and videos of their sort of conferences, we call them, where, previously the Bilderberg group obviously does everything behind closed doors. It's a very secretive group, it puts out an agenda, where it lists like 10 different topics, but tells you nothing else. They
Right.
obviously now put up who attends, but that was only around 2012, 13. They even made a website, and it was founded in 1954. So how do you think the groups differ? Because obviously Klaus Schwab, actually, if you go on the Bilderberg website, he used to be a steering committee member. So how do you compare the Bilderberg group, the World Economic Forum? Is the Bilderberg group still relevant, or is the World Economic Forum still more, they're going more down the public route because people don't really take much notice? Is the Bilderberg group still kind of relevant?
That's a great question. I've actually had entire conversations about this whole point in like with more than once actually. Like, so my thought a long time ago was, okay, well, why would they continue at the point which Bilderberg became, a public talking point, where they like literally the news is releasing these 10 talking points, even though, and I often reference one of the last big ones we heard was the whole post-truth world, which is obviously was an agenda we can clearly see played out. But my point was, why would that be the meeting if it's such a public reality? We all know about it. I mean, it was moments ago was regarded as not even real, and now it's like, oh yeah, it's just a think tank. I would argue that it's probably still something that matters. They get together, they talk, and so on. But I would argue that it's either one of two things: either that there are other meetings, which we could list many of them, I'm sure we're familiar with, that are behind the scenes to some degree, but that they just kind of shift there, or the ones we don't even know about. But I actually go the other direction, is what we were just talking about. Is Matt Ehret's written about this kind of same concept here. I think what we're seeing is this entity, or these entities, kind of reemerging. And so that's what's happening is, as you just said, the World Economic Forum is sort of like the public face now of this same kind of thing. They're operating right on the surface now. It's like, no, but we're doing this for you, and for it's the same thing they argue the rest of it was, right? They're just collecting to discuss for the future of the world, and it's the same kind of game. So I think what we're seeing is that kind of next step, where they're going to establish themselves. And we can overlap this with the World Health Organization Pandemic Accord, the loss of sovereignty, of whether through medical or otherwise. That's kind of the direction, is that they're collecting the power at the centralized kind of international stage, where, at least on a medical point now, they're moments away from establishing where they can say, this is what we want to happen, and you no longer can say anything as a country. And so that's really concerning. I mean, imagine if the Bilderberg meeting could have voted on something and then everyone had to comply. That's kind of where this is going right now. But I guess because they're doing it on the surface, it's not concerning. Like, I think that's kind of your point. That's an interesting thing to think about. Like, maybe that was the planned action to make it seem like because all the people out there, the normies, if you will, they're going to say, they're not, dude. It's right there. They're telling you right in the surface. It's not a conspiracy theory. Like, I get why that might make sense to them. That it's not a secret if it's right in front of you. But it's they just, I guess the point is, they would argue they dispute the outcome of what they're saying. That they're going to do this, but we say, well, here's what they're trying to accomplish. They just disagree with the outcome. I mean, I don't see why a technocratic future is something anybody would want, but that's just me.
Yeah, I would still say probably the Bilderberg group does have some relevance. I mean, if you look at their meeting in 2022, like, there was some seriously big hitters, and the media did not report it until I actually did. It was one of my first ever videos. Wouldn't recommend watching it. But if you go and look and scroll through the media, not one of them mentioned about Bilderberg except The Guardian, because I think his name's Charlie Skeleton, something like that, because he actually went there. But no one else reported on it, and like, their meeting agenda was all like Russia, Ukraine, China, the Indo-Pacific, technology competition, which is all China, Russia. You had, the NATO Secretary General, ex-MI6 heads, the CIA chief, all there. You had the Finland Prime Minister at the same time as the NATO Secretary General's there, and Jens Stoltenberg actually put a photo on his Twitter, a picture of them discussing and saying about their, their membership of NATO. And it says on the Bilderberg website that, no, this is fine because they're not there in their their as in their profession. They're just there to discuss as normal individuals. But you have the King of the Netherlands there as well. Like, come on, obviously, like, they're not just there to be themselves, are they?
Well, it doesn't even matter, to be quite honest. I mean, even whether or not they're there on a personal capacity or not, are we pretending that they're not discussing politics? And I mean, obviously, the point you just made is that they are, but no, I'm just discussing them as an individual. It doesn't matter. You don't disconnect yourself from your personal, your professional standing in the world. You're literally, I mean, it's they know that, though. I mean, it's insulting to our intelligence to pretend that that's not a violation, right? I mean, the same thing with I mean, really any of these things. If we have members of the media, the government, any authority conducting behind closed doors to discuss policy, I mean, that's a violation to any number of these countries' populations, and they know this. But see, at the same point, though, I argue that Bilderberg, if let's just say there was like a very important kind of under the surface topic, I would just argue that it wouldn't be done in a place where we'd be able to see it on a bullet point. Like if that was the case, but I mean, it's just an opinion, but I agree with you. There's still very powerful people that collect and talk about these things behind closed doors. So, and then we should even ask if what they write on that piece of paper is even what they're actually talking about. So who knows?
Yeah, we do. You have literally got to take their word. And actually, just going back to my point there, they actually had attendees. They normally always do from The Economist and the Financial Times. And you think they did a little media report? I checked Economist, Financial Times, not a peep. I'm sure it's a similar situation in the World Economic Forum where the media, the World Economic Forum, do they have people from the media who are obviously allowed to watch it, or are they just attendees?
No, I've seen examples of people. Well, see, what's interesting today more than ever is there's a really weird and unsettling overlap of like stars and people in politics and the media, where suddenly you've got these people that are now like personalities who are, like journalists, but really they're like CNN or Fox News, but I have seen people that are like that kind of overlap in the position where they're considered somebody in the journalism field. They're also still involved or, and so on, or even someone that was in journalism, but now in politics. The bottom line though, is that, excuse me, that most definitely that's continuing to happen. And I ask yourself how it makes sense that somebody from, let's say, the Financial Times would go to this meeting and then not cover it. So what were you there for? Like, what are you arguing that you're there? Like, for what? So for inside information, for future work? Like, it seems that's irresponsible is not the right word. It's dishonest. You know what I mean? Like there's something more going on there. And like, I've actually heard them talk about this, where these journalists will discuss in like previous, people that have kind of like spoke out of turn, breaking the Chatham House rules or whatever, that basically that they feel that if they go and play the game, well, they'll get inside scoops down the line, where somebody in the circles will reach out to them thinking they're part of the team or whatever, which makes sense. But they're not doing what their job is by being there. They're doing it for personal benefit. And that implies there's a kind of an agreement. That's not how it's supposed to work. Truth to power is not shaking hands for information from people that you're supposed to hold accountable,
Yeah, I'd like to know what, like, when they come back, obviously, because it's like a 3-day event. The last one was in Washington. So they go back to the, Financial Times or The Economist and their editor-in-chief, or they probably are the editor-in-chief, but, other employees there or their boss, like, how was it? Fancy writing up anything? No, obviously not. But anyway, just to, you've discussed the fourth industrial revolution briefly. Can you talk about some of the kind of weirder, techie, transhumanist things that are being pushed? Obviously the brain chips is the most obvious one, but, there's the famous video of Klaus Schwab where he's like, the fourth industrial revolution is like the digital, biological, and the physical. I'm not sure, you might know the quote better than me.
I have the clip, actually. We could probably pull it up, but it's the biological, digital, and now you say that, now I'm blanking on it as well.
Just the digital technology. Just think of genetics, think of brain research, and so on. And the power of the fourth industrial revolution comes from the combination of all those technologies. Actually, I was saying it's at the end. What the fourth industrial revolution will lead to is a fusion of our physical, our digital, and our biological identities.
Point is that you're talking about blending all of these things for, and the real big point is the digital biological part of that, right? Where they're literally, and this is one of the points we were getting into before about the, this being discussed before COVID and then being kind of initiated during it. And the point is, if we're the ones online just simply going, what about, a microchip, let's say. We're not saying there's a microchip in the injection. We're saying, could there be? Could that be something they might want to do in the future? And the conversation becomes tinfoil hat, black helicopter, ridiculous crap. And the interesting thing is you can literally listen to that same person tell you that will be happening in the fourth industrial revolution. And then my secondary point was, remember, he's telling you that is now what's happening. So it's not only logical to ask whether or not that might be involved in this clearly manipulated, dishonest agenda, it's likely, because they're telling you that's the future. There's even been discussions about microchips involved with injections. Look, my point is, I don't think that's actually what's happened, unless we find more evidence. It doesn't seem to be, but it certainly could be. But they're arguing all this stuff for the future. They've talked about pills that you can swallow to track whether you've taken medications. They've talked about injectable things, nanotechnology wise. I mean, I'll even take a step back, covering something from, I think, 2007, 2010. It was a symposium on nanotechnology where this guy was talking about smart dust that long ago, and saying at that time they had the technology to make smart dust that was, I think, something like a tenth the size, the tenth the size of a piece of paper, like laying down on a piece of table, like that thin, that you know, smart dust, you could blow it in the air, it could land on your skin, and using your own body's motion and heat, it could run off your body, and it used RF, it could communicate two-way, all this different stuff. So it's really alarming when you see them hold up some gigantic thing and go, cutting edge technology today. We're being deceived, right? It's very clear that they're so far past that. And so my big concern was whether that was something that might have been overlapped with what's been in the injections, what's being sprayed in the air. I mean, it's a valid point to ask. But to go further into it, we have, you know, as you pointed out, the brain-machine interface conversation. We've seen discussions of things like hydro nanogels, these bio, like the big concern there is we're talking about this next overlap step of the self-assembling kind of nanobot conversation. And again, that is like pre-COVID. People are screaming about how that is the next step. That's the future, whether it's graphene oxide, hydroxide, self-assembling nanobots, all across the board, raving about how that's the future of vaccination. And then it gets completely quiet during COVID, and people raise the question and they get derided as conspiracy theorists, which maybe that's right, maybe it's not in them, but I think it's really concerning there. But all of that is kind of this weird nebulous kind of like wild west of where this seems to be going. And then, you know, we've talked about gain of function and all of this. I mean, all of these things are in this direction of, I think, controlling the human species, really, right? Like bringing it down to a level where they get rid of what is vulnerable, which is humanity, right? And that's where the whole transhumanist technocratic direction is going. So it's step by step trying to drive people into the normalization of that. And on a weird side note, I don't know, you know, what you stand on different, you know, politics and so on. I tend to believe that the overhype, not of the transgender discussion, is, in my opinion, an early step to normalize the idea of altering your body in ways that, you know, for your own personal, you know, implantables and so on. So as he says, the next step is going to be implantables. This is Klaus Schwab speaking, like in the beginning of COVID. It's going to be implantables after your wearables, which is already what's happening, right? That's where the digital ID and all that kind of comes over. But then it's going to become the brain. And this is what he says in an open discussion, that it's very soon. We'll be able to sit in this audience and I'll be able to read your thoughts and understand what you're saying, and you'll be able to do the same. And like, this is open discussion about not 50 years from now, but what he says is supposed to be happening now.
Very fast. But can you imagine that in 10 years when we are sitting here, we have an implant in our brains, and I can immediately feel, because you all will have implants, and we measure your brain waves, and I can immediately tell you how the people react, or I can feel how the people react to your answers. Is it imaginable?
I think that is imaginable. I think I think, you know, you can imagine that. You can imagine, well, you're going to be sort of transplanted into, you know, the internet, so to speak, to live forever in a digital realm. You know, you can imagine that, you know, you just in your biological incarnation are going to live to be some, you know, very long age.
In the fourth industrial revolution, right? And there's an endless conversation of these kind of next generation eerie kind of, you know, technology, but the nanotechnology is what really concerns me. And we know there's lipid nanoparticles in the injection, right? I mean, that's just nanoparticles. But the nanotechnology direction, where we get into nanobots and smart dust and these kind of outside controlled mechanisms, what was it? I think it's ferritin nanoparticle injections are something they've researched from the DoD, and the Guardian wrote about this, for ways that you can use to control people's minds. They've already done it with animals and bugs, and this is a real thing. I mean, but you talk about on Twitter, you're a conspiracy theorist, right? That's where this should be going, and the fact that we're not asking these questions about the injections, it scares the hell out of me, you know?
Yeah, I thought it just crossed me for maybe people listening. We're probably racing through a bit. So can you just maybe explain to people, one, what transhumanism is, what you mean by the smart dust, the nanoparticles, being in the vaccine? Because again, if someone hears this, rapidly going over it, it's going to go over their head. And, there's too many, like I remember myself, when I first start watching you or whoever it is, and you sort of forget even now, when you're speaking to someone that things that they don't, and you're mentioning this and this to link up to that, and they don't know where any of it means. So
Yeah.
should we just take a breather, slow down, like what's transhumanism, what are these nanobots you're talking about, what's smart dust, and then we can go from there.
Yeah, it's funny. See, my show, and it's just like hours of just going over information and talking. And so I tend to do that, where you think people are already aware of things because you've talked about it so much, right? So thank you. Feel free to jump in and tell me to shut up. We keep going. So the transhumanism discussion is really concerning to me, and I think this is the converse, just to make it simple, about the transition into kind of like an overlap, like cyborg kind of direction, where you're implantables is one of those arguments, right? That people even argue that already with wearables and your phone in your pocket, you're kind of like already in that step direction. Because if you really think about it, their phone, for specifically for a lot of people, new generations, I mean, you don't even put that down. It never even leaves your side. I mean, it's basically a part of your body almost, right? And so that's kind of concerning. And I think that's part of where that's going. But the argument is about kind of from like the political or even more kind of like religious kind of perspective, I would argue it's about transcending humanity, right? Creating a situation where you one can't die, right? Artificial intelligence, kind of where you can create specifically, there are people that are studying whether you can put your consciousness inside of a computer, right? That's one angle of that, where you're then essentially, I guess, can't die, you're going to live forever. But the argument being that is the objective, to create a situation where we're no longer vulnerable, right? And that's, I argue, stems from kind of like this eugenics mindset of trying to better ourselves to the point to where, but it really comes from these elitists that I think are scared of dying, maybe for a religious connotation, I don't know, but that's kind of why I think of these old billionaires are like, let's find a way to make sure we don't die. But then you have the argument of just kind of like the overlap of the technological direction, right? So you could have, bionic arms and body parts and, that kind of thing, or rather, where I think it's going immediately is trying to like enhance your body using genetic manipulation. Like, so you could genetically engineer things that could alter, whether you could alter something like create a new eyeball and have that kind of transplant, or actually just use genetic manipulation to alter your body in a way that makes you faster or stronger. Like that's all of that applies. It's this really nebulous kind of manipulate. That's what scares me about it, is that it's real, and it's, I mean, not even really under the surface. I mean, this whole technocrat overlap, even with eugenics, like pre-COVID, these same groups involved have been talking about this stuff before World War II. That's what World War II and the Nazis, but that's eugenics. And it stems from before them with the United States government and plenty of other powers. So the real interesting thing is that I think the impetus behind all of it is dark, right? I mean, and I think what they're selling people on is, yay, we're going to remove sickness and we're going to be able to, replace people that don't have legs. And everyone's like, why would you hate that? Don't you want people to walk again? And that's how they frame it. And it really scares me because some of the people behind it have just almost on the surface kind of dark intentions. Taking Bill Gates, for example, you can show all over the place. See, here I go. I'm like going from one point to, again, just like you were saying, but you can see him from GMOs and different past examples where the actions he's taking have failed repeatedly and repeatedly hurt the people they say they're trying to help over and over. The oral polio vaccine, the GMOs in India, and it keeps happening. And yet these same people keep being the ones pointed at for the next step. So I posed the question of whether or not they are trying to hurt people, and I'm saying, I don't know that, but we should ask that question. But the transhumanism thing in general, I think, is the interesting focal point that kind of blends with the technocrats in general. If for those who don't know, in general, that is more about kind of that overlap of all of this, the elitist kind of eugenics mindset about trying to, really it comes down to like a religious mindset about technology and these people that are going to be using this to control our lives and so on. But then what was the nanotechnology part of it is one aspect of this new technological direction. So obviously nanotechnology, like I was trying to say before, is, nanoparticles are just small particles. That's all it really means. They're, I mean, there's impossible, like, dust kind of size or even smaller. And so that is also can be used in ways like nanolipid particles, right? Lipid nanoparticles. So that is technology technically, but it's not like a robot, right? Whereas you have actual nanotechnology, which I was explaining, which are literal. I mean, I think robots are archaic. That's not even the right term for it, but we're talking about technology, right? And so these are things that are the size of dust that can be deployed. And this has been around since the early 2000s. I mean, God only knows what they're capable of today, that could be used in a lot of different ways, whether we're talking about geoengineering, whether we're talking about bioweapons, whether we're talking about medicine. I mean, that's where all this is. And so the question is, why has that not been discussed in such a deeper way, even though it's been used in military purposes in ways that we talked about decades ago? So my thought is, like, why would it get so quiet? It makes me concerned that it's being used in a way that we don't want to know about, I mean, go ahead. I'll cue off you. What's the next thing you want to get into?
Yeah, again, I mean, even when you hear gene editing, again, I can just hear like alarm bells. People might think, it's made, or they might think it's real in science terms, but all these things are obviously being discussed. I mean, with the brain chips, again, just because you're against maybe brain chips for one purpose doesn't mean, for the good side of it, of, like a deaf person, a blind person, or, with their limbs. No one's against that. It's just, you got to put it in perspective of, okay, look at your phone. Well, yeah, your phone is a great resource, but then on the other hand, they used it to surveil you. Edward Snowden leaks is obviously pretty clear with that. So if they're going to do that with your phone, do you trust a brain chip?
Seriously.
And you can hear Jason Burmas talks about it with Dennis Bushnell. You can hear a video of him. Yeah, the brain chips being used, for good purposes, but then, DARPA, who's like the technology sort of wing of the U.S. military, is also, trying to do it for super soldiers.
Fusion, which are only 10 to the 6th, 10 to the 7th, and we are now able to store these for 1,000 minutes, which means they're available. Humans are now becoming cyborgs. We have cochlear implants to hear, artificial retinas to see, artificial hearts to live, artificial limbs to move, artificial organs to functions, and brain chips. There's a couple 100,000 people wandering around with brain chips now to fix congenitally defective brains and increasingly to fix memory and other things. DARPA's working on brain chips for super soldiers. And people are now working, thanks to Musk and other people, funding on direct machine-brain communications. It's not us versus them, us versus the machines. We're merging. And this is the human evolution of the humans. There is no more natural evolution of anything. People are convinced that the human evolution of everything is 10 million times faster than any natural evolution. And so this is just part of the human evolution of the humans, which will apply in a little bit when I talk about something else. Then there's tele-everything, which...
So there's obviously, there's each side of it, isn't there? There's the good side and the bad side. And yeah, if you're saying it to a random person, what's wrong with, a deaf person getting their hearing back? Do you not want that? But yeah, that's good. And, the technology is in the hands of good, meaning well people, which, not every single person who probably goes to the World Economic Forum or wherever it is actually maybe a bad person. It's just, it can be hijacked for other purposes. You could take, the TV, the radio is used so you could listen to that or watch that, or then it could also be used against you. So that's sort of the argument.
Absolutely agree. I mean, and it's important that you mentioned DARPA, because we have to remember the overlap with, and this is kind of where this kind of connects in my mind that makes me nervous about what might have happened, is that, DARPA and the DOD, I mean, that's Operation Warp Speed. I mean, that's what it's weird that people are only kind of now coming to becoming aware that this whole thing was a Department of Defense operation. I mean, that's what it was on the surface, right? And so it's interesting to think about the overlap when they were working with these things like these nano hydrogels and these self-assembling nano platforms. I mean, all this different stuff is wildly concerning, and they're the ones that were involved with the kind of the impetus behind the injections and where that goes, and so I don't know, it makes me really nervous about whether there is an experiment taking place around all of this. I mean, here's another example. For instance, there's an interesting discussion about this, interleukin 10 and these things involved with these different reactions of the injections and different things and reactions of the body. And the point is that there's a connection that I find about how these things are being shown to alter the way that the body ages. or rather essentially mimics aging or vice versa, right? And I was like, well, that's really strange, especially with the overlap with these people talking about trying to find ways to prolong life and so on. So I'm, what the question just simply is, again, whether or not these people would be willing to, and willing to test on us was the point, but it could just be isolated too. We've had conversations about different batches and different severities and so on. So it's like we have to wonder whether or not people have taken advantage of what's been going on around the world, maybe in other countries, and have executed experiments. I mean, we that that could have happened under all the madness that was going on in some corner of the world no one's paying attention to. You know what I mean? It's like I almost would guarantee that happened at some point. Anyway.
I mean, yeah, the U.S. military, if they're involved, it's kind of, again, Moderna obviously got funding from DARPA, again, the military, the sort of the technology wing of the military. Before it was ARPA, that's where the internet comes from. But that's another discussion. But yeah, if the U.S. military is involved, it's kind of hard to trust them with their track record. But anyway, I thought I'd move maybe the conversation on to something maybe a little less confusing for people. So maybe you could talk about some of the clips that have come out of Klaus Schwab talking about penetrating the cabinets, the young global leaders, listing different people who have been on it.
Yeah. I mean, that's a really important point that goes back to what we were saying before, is that the Young Global Leaders program has been around for a long time, and at least as Klaus Schwab has stated, there's disputes over some of these things, which is interesting, like whether Putin was a young global leader. But he said it numerous times on the stage himself. Klaus Schwab has said that. The point being that pretty much every major head of state in the West and most of these different other countries have at one point or another been either a young global leader or worked as one of these entities within the World Economic Forum. And it's on the videos that have been released and not secretly. In fact, that main video has been misattributed as some sort of secret cam, but he was openly saying this stuff. Basically, because he either doesn't think we perceive it as bad, or for some crazy reason he doesn't perceive it as bad. I don't buy that. Just openly saying, as you've seen, that we've penetrated the cabinets, or rather that we've gotten individuals in media and government, and just lists this off. And it's amazing that people can't stand back and ask why that's acceptable. You know what I mean? Like, so whether or not you have good intentions, you have somebody who is inserting people into positions of power who he has influence over, who's not elected, right? Who is not being decided by anybody other than his own. That's wildly out of bounds, right? But so too are the things we discussed about Bilderberg and whatever else. It's what people, I think, are beginning to see is that these boundaries are not for them, right? I mean, they've never been that way. And then we're just kind of beginning to see that it's always been this way to a degree, So there's a lot of these videos coming out from Klaus Schwab and others involved that admit the real point of this. I mean, Derek Rose wrote an excellent article just simply pointing out the stated purpose of one of these sub meetings was just it was about the great narrative was the term. And it's like, so they're literally having a meeting about how they're going to create the narrative, not what we're going to do, but here's how we're going to sell them on what we're going to do. It's like, it's almost inherently dishonest on the surface, but people don't pay attention to that, or they watch the conversations around it. They think that we're somehow misinterpreting it. But everything, these videos you've seen, were even Jane Goodall sitting there telling you things, they are telling you exactly what the kind of general mindset is, which is that they're okay altering things that we have no say over, things that we think are just, like Whitney Webb's written about the overlap of sort of these legacy systems, whether we each have a car or, these things that we become accustomed to, that they are choosing to change whether or not we want that, and this is all right on the surface, and I think Klaus Schwab has repeatedly stated this over and over, that this is happening now, that we're going to alter all these things, that our biology and the digital world are going to blend, and it's just going to happen, and that we need some kind of catalyst to execute it. And so that becomes COVID-19.
Yeah, just for people, for that clip. So I'm not sure if it's a Harvard, but he basically sitting next to a guy who's asking questions. They have a crowd, and he talks about how he penetrated the cabinets of Canada and Argentina and maybe France. And he talks about, Trudeau, Macron were part of the Young Global Leaders program.
And this goes back to Dean Elwood. That when you brought the Young Global Leaders Program here for executive education and the Schwab Fellows, but there are two countries in the world now in which the young global leaders have emerged. Tell us just a bit about that in terms of the governance.
Yes,
Actually, this notion to integrate young leaders is part of the World Economic Forum since many years. And I have to say, when I mention now names like Mrs. Merkel, even Vladimir Putin and so on, they all have been young global leaders of the World Economic Forum. Mm-hmm. But what we are very proud of now, the young generation, like Prime Minister Trudeau, President of Argentina and so on, that we penetrate the cabinets. So yesterday I was at a reception for Prime Minister Trudeau, and I know that half of this cabinet, or even more half of this cabinet, are actually young global leaders of the World Economic Forum.
And that's true in Argentina too. Wow.
Yeah.
Sorry. That's true in Argentina as well.
It's true in Argentina, and it's true in France now. Mm-hmm. I mean, with the president, with a young global leader, but
listening to further parts of that clip, though, that one clip was kind of like a quick generalization. He spoke at greater length in different locations where, I mean, it's basically every single major government. I mean, that's just like the most alarming thing to realize. That's not a fake conspiracy. That is a real global conspiracy, whether you think it's for good intentions or not. They are conspiring to, let's just say for them to hear it, to save the world. They're still conspiring, though, right? They're still trying to do it, right? But they're not really trying to save the world at all. In fact,
yeah. Again, another famous clip, and there was an article. This is from many years ago. I'm guessing you may be familiar with TrueStream Media. They were one of the few people who actually sort of covered the World Economic Forum before COVID. I mean, I'd never heard of it, but I wasn't really in that sphere at that time. But they covered it a lot. They have a video on it from a long time ago where it's the World Economic Forum, and it's like an MP from Denmark talking about how you'll have no privacy in 2030 and you'll be happy. And, that video went round. But basically, she's saying you'll rent everything, and while you're at work, your house will be used for a meeting room from someone else. And, why do you need to own your car, a phone? Everything will be rented. But then there's obviously the question is, who are you renting it from? Yeah, sure, you'll own nothing and be happy, apparently. But the people who are saying this tend to live in luxury and travel around on private jets. So,
yeah, that's the crux of the issue right there, is that somebody's got to own all this stuff, right? So somebody's going to have all the power. Obviously, we're talking about these same people, and that's the idea. So you have nothing, and apparently you're gonna be happy, right? But they are the people that are in control of all the assets. Why? Because they're the good people, right? They're doing it for you, and that's historically not just naive. It's insulting. It's just not even remotely accurate, But you brought up a good point that we should include, which is the overlap of the UN 2030 Sustainable Development Goals, which is the obvious important part of all of this, which is kind of the lie, right? The Sustainable Development Goals. It's not even remotely what they're trying to achieve, but this is how they're hitching it to this whole 2030 agenda and you'll find everything under the sun seemingly tagged to this weird date objective, and I feel like that's kind of what is interesting about where this has all gone, is it feels like we all kind of felt this was rushed to a degree, right? Like it just, for whatever reason, they just kept pushing this, even though people were seeing through it. And I think that it's because they feel there's some kind of a time limitation here on what they're trying to achieve, right?
Are you referring to like the digital ID? And again, so I found this quite interesting. So wherever you think about the vaccine, where, if you got it, if you was for it, just put that aside and just think about. So there was the World Economic Forum had a paper, and it has like this picture of the digital ID, and it's tied to your banking, your medical, it's linked to everything. And then, fast forward during obviously the pandemic, and the vaccine passport was being pushed a lot, but it was obviously a digital one. And I can't remember the name of the company. They actually, I think, they sell arms to different countries. But they said, this is a great start because eventually we can link it to banking. And people were like, this is just like the way to, move to the next step. So, and you had the vaccine initiatives like VIC or VCI, and it was just all these tech firms like Microsoft, Oracle, but then there was also the military side of it with like ex-FBI people. Obviously there's different functions. The tech people companies will obviously make money from a digital ID.
Oh yeah.
and then cash is out the window. So, MasterCard and Visa, they make more money because everything goes through a credit card. And then there's the military side, they can use it as surveillance. I think it was called like MITR, MITR. Are you familiar with that?
I'm not ringing a bell at the moment, but I mean, the whole thing is the important crowd. I recommend Catherine Austin Fitts on that focal point. That's just the financial side of this is, if not the most important, one of the most important aspects to understand. I mean, all of this is driven in this direction. I think everyone has their different opinions on what was kind of like the main objective to all of this, but you could easily argue this was one of the main points about trying to justify the need for a passport, a vaccine passport, which has been discussed for a long time. ID 2020 program had already linked vaccine passports and digital IDs long before we got to this point. Even a woman actually resigned in protest out of, she called it techno. What was the term she used? Basically just argued exactly what we're talking about from the point of the ID 2020 program. She's like, this is, they're trying to push in this manipulation to justify vaccine passports and IDs. And they just kind of shut it down, didn't acknowledge that she said that. But then the point is that the digital passport justification is the fast track to the social credit, the central bank digital currencies, like the point that we can get to a point in this technocratic world where you can just be shut off. Oh, you said the wrong thing. Oh, you said hate speech. Your credit card doesn't work, right? You can't even, you turned off your smart house that you can't get into now. Your car was just shut down. Like all these things are actually really happening right now. I just read an article about Ford already looking into patents about being able to shut off and actually remotely drive your car if you don't pay your payments. I mean, it's like all of this stuff is on a fast track right now. And the only way they can get you under that system is to make sure you have a digital ID that you have to be in line with. Right. And the vaccine passport, I think the medical tyranny, the medical apartheid kind of control system is obviously really important, but it's not, they don't need the medical side to do that. I mean, the passport is what they need, the digital, barrier to where you then have to engage with to be able to access any number of things that all of them be linked to social services, your bank account, all of that. I mean, think about how alarming that is, knowing that we've already seen people in Canada, for example, have their entire bank accounts shut down because they protested. You know what I mean? Like, it's obvious where this is going. And even if you believe it's all for good reasons and good intentions, are we going to pretend that there's not bad people that might choose to abuse that system? I mean, that's just the reality of the world. So yeah, we're on a fast track to a very dangerous, as we've called, a technocratic panopticon, right? And all the things we talked about today all interlink and overlap. And I think, I mean, I kind of see what you were saying in the beginning there. Is my mind's all over the place that the next step is the kind of nanotechnology kind of direction, so that people can get lost in that. But I really see how these things then lead into that. And I mean, the kind of idea, if we get into a world where we're talking about like deployable nano, any number of things, I mean, it's not just technology. I mean, we have to realize Charles Lieber, who was involved at Harvard, leading scientist in the world on nanotechnology, specifically virus mimicking nanotechnology. He was arrested, remember, right before this whole thing started. He was caught, somebody with him was caught shipping biomaterial, it was blood, in his sock from Beth Israel Hospital to China, right? Lieber got arrested for, arguably, they said, for telling them about the money he was making between these, the deals and so on. But what's interesting is how he got kind of shuttled away. And by the way, he's continued to work on this technology from behind the scenes up until like a couple months ago. So my question is whether or not that is exactly what we're talking about. Virus mimicking nanotechnology, right? And the idea that they were doing this in 2011, right? So the point is that not something that could be deployed with that? And the argument is what they achieved in 2011 is they made it to where when you deploy, if you put this in the wild, you cannot tell the difference between something that is made like that and an actual organic example of that in the world. So I ask whether that's actually what we're dealing with today. Anyway, the point is that concerns me. And I think that's the next step of where all this seems to be going once they get us in this kind of controlled digital ID kind of world,
Yeah, I think you just got to take a step back and sort of look at what's happened the last few years. Whatever you thought about COVID or the vaccines, you've got to take away. It's like cash. I never use cash. And people will be like, oh, we're going to go cashless. Who cares? It's not about even if you want to use it. It's about obviously having the option to use it. Because after the last couple of years, it shows you, okay, maybe you was on the right side of it, but it was only your friends who were going to get shot. But, they was, good people you probably thought before who were on the other side of it, who generally were going to get their their lives taken away, weren't allowed to travel, weren't allowed to go to nightclubs, weren't allowed to enjoy their life because the government or said they couldn't. So you've got to look at it as, well, what if that was in 10 years time and we did have no cash, or you didn't, what would you do if you was shut out of society and you're like, well, that's it, I'm just going to get my money out now, travel around the country with cash and just try and do what you can. You can't go, I think Starbucks where I live, they won't take cash anymore. Again, I never use cash really, but it's having the option of, maybe I should use it more. I just don't want to lose it, basically.
Yeah.
So or whatever, but
I mean, think about the point there, though. This is where you can see an obvious example of the allowance of this kind of action by, I don't know, police, government. I mean, that's a crime. It says right there on that dollar bill, legal tender, right? And the idea that they can decide not to accept certain legal tender, that's not allowed, right? I mean, that's like saying, no, I'm only taking $5 bills today, right? They don't get to do that, right? And if you're an operating business and you accept transactions, as people understand it, you're not allowed to decide that. But see, that is being allowed now because the direction is going there. The government wants that. It's just, that is so concerning to me. And I think coming back to the central bank digital currencies, that's if they can give us a currency that we need to use that can then be shut off in that same way, which, by the way, the people involved with this direction, I believe the president of was it IBC Bank? Is that, I forget if that's, there are many different, I'm going to look up I don't want to misquote it. IBC, I think. But they said, many of them said on the record, like, look, the main part about this is that these can be turned off. Right? Like, so basically the bank can then dictate, or rather whoever's controlling it, what is allowed and what's not. And they can then decide whether they want to stop that from being used in certain ways. Or one of the experts in this discussion, actually, I think this was, I forget, it was at the World Economic Forum or something kind of adjacent to it. But the argument being that, like, why do we think we want these things? Like, we already have digital transact, we have Venmo, and we can do that. The only difference is it gives the government more power over how we can use it. Why does anybody want that? You see, I don't think average people understand that that's what it is. They're being sold on the flowery language of where it seems to be going. We just got to be smarter than that. And I think that we are. I think that many people are buying into the illusion, that they're selling us.
I'm guessing, obviously, we're going to have to finish up soon, so I'll just try and do a few more questions. Yeah, why do you think they are kind of so open with it? Is it, brazenness? I don't mean the actual, when they're talking about sort of on stage, where like the Nokia CEO said, your phone's probably going to be inside of you in 10 years. I mean, like where Klaus Schwab is saying, we penetrated the cabinets. And then, the Israeli guy, Yuval Harari, I'm not sure how you pronounce his surname. I mean, he comes out and says, like, humans are, hackable, and that COVID, the COVID years were great because it showed that people was willing, to give up their rights for like biometrics and all this surveillance, basically.
Arc for the development of Homo sapiens, and you've looked far into the future. Does this COVID-19 crisis, which you call the biggest crisis of our lifetimes, does it to you represent, in the end, little more than a bump in the road, or is it something more profound than that?
For me, as a historian, it's really very interesting, this moment right now. I think that in our lifetime, if you think in terms of a couple of decades, it will be big. Not because of the epidemic itself, but even more so because of the economic and political consequences. But in the long sweep of history, thousands of years, no, I don't think it will be one of the big events of history. It could be a watershed event in several ways, like we discussed earlier with surveillance. People could look back in 100 years and identify the coronavirus epidemic as the moment when a new regime of surveillance took over, especially surveillance under the skin, which I think is maybe the most important development of the 21st century, is this ability to hack human beings, to go under the skin, collect biometric data, analyze it, and understand people better than they understand themselves. This, I believe, is maybe the most important event of the 21st century. The moment when a system out there knows me better than I know myself. It has never been like this before.
He's kind of off the scene now, but there was just clips going around him just saying, like, to anyone who's not ingrained in it, like you, like, I'm probably still, but like, this is some bizarre stuff saying, but like, they're not like booing him or saying it's crazy. This is an actual discussion.
Yeah, well, I mean, he's a good example of all this. Now, I've asked whether, like, I think that he is doing is like a design, like so they can say, yeah, well, it was out there, right? Well, it wasn't secret, where like that kind of thing, where it's just regarded as kind of outlandish or too in the future or crazy, or he is just saying it and it's kind of the quiet part out loud. I don't really know, but I mean, it's like the great point you made right there. They're not like standing up in protest and going, "What? How dare he say that?" Like they're all like, "Yeah, good point." It's like it's really alarming. And you're right. The things that he has said that that COVID has proven that people are willing to do this, or willing to give up their rights, or that we can overlap digital by like everything we're talking about right now, that it's all been rationalized, normalized. In fact, he's insinuated and outright stated that these things were done for that purpose. I mean, that's really concerning to me. But I forgot. What was your question? Was that just those clips? Apologies, I forgot.
Yeah, it was just like more about like how open they are. Because some people, Joe Biden's sort of that guy sometimes who can go a bit off script and just, like the Council of Foreign Relations, where he says, he got that prosecutor in Ukraine fired, or he did his Harvard speech where he said, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, the UAE was willing to throw arms and money at just about whoever in Syria, insinuating, like Al Qaeda, terrorists, Al Nusra and stuff. Yeah. So it maybe, some people just, I don't know, just have they're just in a bubble. But even then, you think like, especially like Klaus Schwab, where he's got a lot of attention on them. You've seen obviously websites and clips getting taken down because they realize like, oh, a lot of people are pushing back against this. So he must have some awareness. So maybe those clips, they're probably a bit older, but like it's just so in your face. Like again, not hiding. He's saying like, we penetrated the cabinets. Oh, no, who? Oh, well, Canada, Argentina. Like he's giving like details. He was like, oh yeah, Trudeau, he was a young global leader. Oh, so is Macron. Like,
it's only really I see two possible options. Is really either that he does not perceive it as being bad. And I don't believe that that he's unaware entirely of the kind of dishonest nature of some of the things that are happening, whether that's just hiding things for your best interest. Again, that's like giving the benefit of the doubt, but I don't believe that, but that's possible. But, or as we were just saying, that it's kind of about putting it in, this happened. This is a classic social engineering, predictive programming. There's ways where they plan to let information out, knowing that it will be almost disregarded, or rather engineering that it is disregarded, but it's out there now, right? That's kind of what I was saying before, is they can then look back and go, oh, no, it was right there. Your conspiracy theory, we were talking about right there on the stage. Everyone heard it, but did it get regarded about? Did it get talked about? Did they do articles about it? Were they incessantly bleeding about it for a week straight like they do about everything else? No, I made this point about Ohio in regard to how it kind of that 10-day period in the beginning of that story where it just wasn't talked about, where my point was like, it's very clear that there were some of them that put articles out, like CNN on the 4th. But I can prove to you that it wasn't on the main page, the homepage of their website. Nobody talked about it on their channels. I think the point is so they can go, oh yeah, we covered it right there. But nobody actually covered it until like the 10th, 10 days afterward. So I think that happens a lot. I think there's an effort to make it appear on the surface that things are being done openly, but really it's about playing us in a certain way. And then we both know today in the post-truth world, right, where it's super easy for them just to be like, no, you conspiracy theorist, don't listen to exactly what he verbatim said. Here's what he meant, right? Like, I mean, with Biden or Trump, actually, right? We've seen that. We're like, no, you dummy. Here's what he actually meant. It's like, he literally just said what we heard, but you're going to tell us he meant something completely different? Yeah, they all do that, And it's just politics. And people that have interests in pretending that's the truth will go along with it. It's a two-party paradigm, But in regard to this exact point, I don't really know exactly why people would ignore it. Whether it's because I'll give them. I think if I had to pick, I think it's the obvious reality that people are afraid of being called conspiracy theorists, right? The quasi independents out there that are maybe trying to do the right thing, but they're kind of a little too close to the mainstream media. Will choose to not get into something when they think that their half normie audience will eat them alive for talking about the wrong thing, right? And I think that happens far too often, even in the independent media too.
I think some of it is just also singing to the choir. Like, I still think pretty much probably every person I know has never heard of the World Economic Forum, the videos and clips can be shared as much as you want, but unless you're in those sort of circles that randomly pops up on your feed, again, you can get stuck in your own mind. Like, oh, haven't you seen these clips going around? Well, no. It's like, take Andrew Tate for one example. I'm not planning to go in him, but like the clips I get of him are all about him talking about the Matrix and stuff like that, because, we follow, I'm not saying him, but, ideas like that, where other people get all the sexist stuff. So I'm like, what's your opinion on Andrew Tate? I'm like, I don't really know. I don't really have one. I don't get the same feed as you because, because it's the same as this. Like, you see all of this, they don't. You assume, oh, they must have heard about it. They must have, but they don't. And that's probably as well why they're happy to, like, the World Government Summit's happy to do a summit all open with that name, do a segment called the New World Order.
Yeah, right.
No one is going to know about it. And the people you do, it's great because you're like, oh, did you see that World Government Summit in Abu Dhabi or Dubai do that segment about the New World Order? They're like, World Government, New World Order. Like, it's on their YouTube, like that's what it's called. And it's like, are they just trolling? They just know, like, people aren't going to see it, or if they do, that's going to sound crazy because they don't have the context. Again, much of what we discussed today, it's going to, some of it even goes over my head because I'm not in it every day as you, but I can, take pieces of it and I'm like, oh, I know a bit about transhumanism, but, unless you're in those circles, you're just not going to have a clue. You're going to hear certain phrases, gene editing, merging with machine. I mean, you heard, I was going to say earlier, Jared Kushner, Trump's son-in-law, I think is Israeli. He says, I'm going to either be the last generation to die or to, what was it? He's like saying he's either going to be the last generation to die or live forever. It was something like that. Like,
when did he say that?
I'll send it to you afterwards. Yeah, Jared Kushner, he was like, we're either going to be the last generation to die and the next generation will be able to have the technology to live on, or like we'll be the last generation not to die. I'll send it to you after. I'm probably butchering it, but he's basically saying, like, he thinks he's going to live forever, or at least my age group.
It's interesting though. I feel like I feel like that rings a bell, but I'm curious when it was, because it'd be interesting to kind of like peg it to a time. Like I imagine it was like middle of COVID kind of time frame, or was it before?
I want to again, like, I've seen the clip fairly recent, but that doesn't mean it's actually recent. I'll send it to you after. I'll try and dig it out. It was going around. I want to say it was in the last year or so, but I'm just guessing. So let's not say that. I'll put it in the show notes.
Yeah, very, very interesting though, because it just speaks to the kind of, well, first to your point about the echo chambers thing is that we're all in that right now, and it speaks to the controlled nature. Again, to the Ohio point, like how in the world that can be kind of not talked about for that size of an event with that huge cloud for 10 days. It's so clear how Twitter, as well as the rest of them, as corporate media and the government, like, we live in a really controlled world, like more so than I think we even realize. Everything is in somehow influenced or nudged or hidden or altered or shaded. It's just crazy. And I think we just need to really come to terms with that, and that's, whether it's because of, saving the world, or because they want to lie, or because of war or money or lithium, it doesn't, at the end of the day, it's still dishonest. We're still being manipulated about what we're supposed to perceive the world is like, and it's concerning, and I think that we need to think about how that works on the social media. And, the Tate example is excellent because it's a great point, because, you're being engineered to view people a certain way. I guarantee that's happening with us, with people out there watching our shows. That's a really concerning step forward. And I think we just need to, like, especially as we are on a fast track into this technocratic, like, hyper controlled world, we need to come to terms with this stuff as individuals before we're suddenly, we can't change what we're looking at. You lose your social credit score and so on,
Yeah, well, I'll wind this down because you've obviously given me over an hour. Again, we've talked about a lot of different subjects. I will try and put as much as I can in the show notes, clips as well. So people, when talking about gene editing, I'll try and find one for that. So maybe if you're ever willing to come on again, we maybe narrow the subject down to maybe make it a bit lighthearted on the viewers.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you inviting me, man. And it's on the whole discussion of the deeper part of it, like, where my mind is at, like on my day-to-day work is like, I just get kind of mired in these, like right now, I would say I'm just like obsessively focused on what's going on in Ohio, research around the chemicals. Even today, I'm actually going to talk about a potential theory about whether this was more about shipping things in regard to something overlapping with Ukraine. It's interesting, but I get kind of like hyper focused on it, you know. And it's like, what's funny about you mentioned that video, for example, about Klaus Schwab, right? And I'm just like, as you say that, I'm like, I can't believe I can't remember the third thing he said. I've said that 1,000 times on my show. I played the clip 100, and it's like, just because I'm like, right now I'm like Ukraine, Ohio, you know, like COVID. It's just so funny how that works. But I appreciate you, you know, being easy on me for not getting all having all the stuff on the top of my head. But I thought it was a great conversation, man, and I'd love to come back. I like, you know, getting into anything really, just talking off the cuff, and I thought we had a good back and forth. So appreciate it, man.
Yeah, it's kind of the same as like a news cycle. Like right now, I'm kind of doing the war on terror, and I'm going, you know, I'm keeping an eye on other stuff. And now that I have a YouTube channel, I try and, you know, dabble obviously and other stuff out of it. But again, you become so narrowed in that. Like I looked a lot like the vaccines and and COVID and everything during then, but like that's almost just gone out of my mind, because I'm like, now I'm thinking about Iraq and Afghanistan and Libya and Syria, and it's like, it's so hard to maintain it all. I guess probably writing maybe articles is probably good for that. Like creating a video is good, but an article as well, having to write it out and actually argue your point kind of refines your memory on it. But yeah, anyway, thanks for coming on. I'll put obviously all your links in the show notes to your website. Is there anything else you want to plug? You know, you writing a book or anything crazy like that? Documentary?
Yeah, well, since you mentioned, I think we're planning to do kind of like a TLAV, Last American Vagabond fundraiser, kind of like telethon kind of thing on the 20th. So keep an eye out for that. I'll be sharing it on my social media. Everyone's going to be stopping by at some point. It'll be like a half day kind of thing.
Like a panel, like you, like, is that going to, as in like you, Derek, Whitney, or?
Yeah, me, Derek Bros, Whitney Webb, Taylor Hudak, Robert Inlakesh, Scott Armstrong, and Matt Arrett. So far is all that's pretty much the core TLAV team. So everyone will be coming by at different points. People can ask questions. It's kind of just like trying to raise funds for the where we're going in the future. And I've put out some feelers for some certain people that have already committed. I'll just let it be a surprise, like some big names out there that might swing by and say hi, answer questions. And on that note as well, keep an eye out for what we're doing with Pirate Stream Media. It's a new venture we're kind of building on the side between Courtney Turner, Scott Armstrong, and myself. And it's Pirate Stream Media, and our show that we're doing, kind of the flagship show of it is called just the Pirate Stream. And
is that where you're broadcasting on other people's YouTube channels to get around censorship? Is that?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Well, that's the TLAV Pirate Streams kind of concept, which I know Corbett's starting to do as well, which I love. We did a whole show on it. But the idea for the new platform was just, so we were discussing a name, and Scott and then put forward, hey, what about the, you know, Pirate Stream Media? Because that's what I kind of coined on the Pirate Stream. And so it's just the name of the platform is just kind of the name of the platform. And what the idea though is to bring people, it's under the kind of Pirate Stream mentality that we're bucking the system. But the daily wrap up is pretty much the ones that broadcast through the Pirate Stream channels. But anyone wants to know more about that, it can be kind of confusing for people that have just heard it. I'll recommend Corbett's interview that we did about that. It's basically just like pirate radio, or better yet, for those the new generation, the Matrix. You know, broadcasting the pirate message into the Matrix. It's the kind of thing we're doing, where they've censored us, so we just find people to give us sometimes big channels, sometimes not, where we just kind of broadcast into, and they delete them every single time, but it gets it out there. People see it. You know, we're reaching that audience, even though they don't want us to. And I know they know what's happening, and I know they hate it. I love it.
Do you have Twitter? I was like, because I'd normally obviously put like someone's Twitter. Do you have Twitter now? I know you had like so many different accounts. Is it even worth me linking your Twitter?
Well, yeah. The now I've been brought back after Elon Musk and the whole thing, and you know, it's which I will say I'm glad about. And I'm happy to get it back, and things have clearly changed on Twitter, but that's a whole conversation. I still see censorship and things happening. I think it's kind of a manipulation, but it's at TLA Vagabond.
Yeah, I'll be able to find it. It's fine.
Yeah, after my handle. To your point about the Pirate Stream, I mean, I did it on Twitter as well and Facebook. Right, people give me their accounts, and I operate through their accounts. It's the same game, man.
Some of that stuff. But yeah, it's definitely a good concept to get around censorship. It's definitely a good idea.
All right, but thanks for having me, man.
Yeah, I'll let you go. So Ryan Christian of the Last American Vagabond. Obviously, we spoke about a lot of stuff. I'll put all his links in the show notes, and thank you for coming on, Ryan.
Thanks, brother.